Okay. This is the Malden instructions in historical context, part of Malden's 375th anniversary celebration. And I'll be talking tonight about the American Revolution, the years leading up to it, the start of the conflict, and the Declaration of Independence, and how Malden connected to those events. I'm going to invite anybody who wants to move closer, and that's only really because you might be able to read this some of the text on the screen a little better if you're closer. But hopefully everybody can hear me through the mic, and that will work well. Clicker, okay. The clicker just stopped working. I don't know why. Okay. Here's a little about me. I had a long career in the software industry as a technical writer and marketing writer, but I earned a master's degree in 2015 in history and got interested in history kind of later in life. I focused on early US history, which is what first got me involved with the Malden Historical Society, because I did a local history project for my master's thesis. So here's some of the questions that I'll be focusing on tonight. We can't discuss everything that's interesting about this period of time, and many of these topics deserve their own talks, but we'll focus on putting some of the things we can learn about Malden into the context of what else was happening in Greater Boston. We're going to focus on the period between 1774 and 1776. The first version of this talk included even more of the early background, but I don't want to repeat what Professor Allison talked about in the fall. So we'll focus on 1774 to start with, and not go into all the background of the Mayflower and the early charters and that stuff. So once I've said that, now we're going to go back to 1760s. In the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, the government tried to bind its colonies more tightly to it. And part of this included having them pay some of the taxes that they hadn't been paying. Now, Britain had an enormous debt, so what they were going to collect from these taxes was just a drop in the bucket. It wasn't about the money, really. It was really more about the importance of the symbol of paying those taxes, somewhat like an insurance copay, right? You are reminded that you have to pay for some of it. So we have the Stamp Act in 1765, the Townshend Acts in 1767, and a circular letter created by Samuel Adams in 1768 about unfair taxation, and that was sent to other colonies, not just towns in Massachusetts. So here we see this phrase about taxation without their consent. This is a common theme in the 1760s. And if you want a copy of the slides, tell me afterwards and I'll send them to you, because I don't expect you to remember all this. So what was happening here in 1768? Well, the governor had decided that people were getting rowdy, which they were, and he decided to send for British troops. This resulted in the Massachusetts Convention of Towns, and that's what Mr. Harnden was attending at Faneuil Hall in September of 1768. So they were not happy about the British troops coming, but they calmed down, cool heads prevailed, and the result, the troops did land, but they weren't resisted. Now, over the course of a few months, roughly 4,000 British troops arrived, and that was roughly equal to the adult male population of Boston. So this was a big impact. From that point on, Boston was occupied by a significant number of British soldiers. We have some confrontations as a result of that caused 5 people to lose their lives, known as the Boston Massacre, which happened in 1770 in March. And as you may recall, the end of 1773 saw the destruction of the tea, otherwise known as the Boston Tea Party, and related events. So tensions were pretty high as we come into 1774. So we have the Boston Massacre, we have destruction of the tea, and partly in response to these events, the British Parliament comes up with a series of acts that are known here as the Intolerable Acts or the Coercive Acts. These aren't just about revenue, they're about control. The Port Act closes the Port of Boston. The Administration and Justice Act has to do with where British people can be tried for crimes. Here, for example, the soldiers could have gone back to England to be tried, under those laws, which were formed partly in response to the Boston Massacre. And some people think that what this will do is eliminate any accountability to the colonists and their governor. And that's a big deal. But the one really big thing here is the Massachusetts Government Act. That said, that charter you've been harping on about? We're going to throw it out. The council and a bunch of other offices will now be appointed, not elected. And town meetings, they can only meet once per year unless the government consents. And this, as you might guess, was a big deal. The governor and lieutenant governor have a lot more power now. The towns had a lot less power. And you can imagine how that went over. So here's General Gage, who's doing all these things. The army also wanted Gage to reduce the armaments available to the colonists by confiscating them. And he confiscated 250 barrels of powder from storage in Somerville. You've probably at least driven past this. The photo is 1935, but it looks pretty much the same today. People became pretty angry about this, but once again, cool heads prevailed. They calmed down. The revolution did not start right then. The same day, and probably as part of that same gathering, a bunch of men and boys attacked a house on Brattle Street. Esther Sewell was really well situated, but her husband was a loyalist, and the crowd knew this. They attacked her home, and she saved herself and her children by giving up the wine in a wine cellar. Loyalists everywhere were intimidated, harassed, sometimes tortured or worse. It was not an easy life. Ultimately, it's estimated that about 60,000 loyalists left during and after the revolution, about 15,000 slaves. Most of them had been born here. Maya Jasanoff writes about the loyalist diaspora. She has a wonderful book about this. While some went to England, a place they had never been because they were born here, their parents had been born here. Others went to Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Quebec, East Florida, which was British at the time, the Bahamas, or Jamaica. About a week before that, Malden's town meeting had met to discuss the Intolerable Acts, and especially the Massachusetts Government Act that had gone into effect in July. They voted their sentiments. The opinion of the town that the late acts of the British Parliament, and particularly those by which the charter of this province is vacated, are very unjust, unreasonable, and cruel, and by no means to be submitted to. And that is the indisputable duty of all persons of every denomination to use their utmost endeavors in their several capabilities by all proper and constitutional ways to prevent, as far as may be, the said acts taking place. Now here's their vote. A committee to meet with other towns. A meeting had been called in Concord for representatives of the towns in Middlesex County to get together. Meanwhile, other colonies are taking note of what's happening in Massachusetts, and here are some resolutions from North Carolina. Resolved that the inhabitants of Massachusetts province have distinguished themselves in a manly support of the rights of America in general, that the cause in which they suffer is the cause of every honest American who deserves the blessings which the Constitution holds forth to them. Now, they're talking here about the British Constitution and also about their own charter. It's a sort of a general constitution rather than a specific document, right? And of course, at the bottom, they say, resolved that it's the most cruel infringement of the rights and privileges of the people of Boston, both as men and members of the British government. So they are looking at their rights as British citizens at this point. Now, this convention takes place in Concord. And what the Maldonians had been invited to was a county level convention. The county was important here because many of the judges served at the county level. And some were newly appointed by the governor. They had a change in how judges were appointed and paid. They were now going to be appointed by the governor, they're going to be paid by the crown. And who pays you is who you're accountable to, right? So we have a problem here if you're in America and you're saying, I want the judges to be accountable to my government, not those people from away. So that meeting was held in Concord on August 30th and 31st. I know that many of the men who attended probably did not want to be in a hot room on the last day of August. I know I would want to be down at Cape, but they came together at Concord and they were asking these questions, which officials are legitimate. They come back with resolves. And I'm not going to read all 19 resolves, but remember that now on September 1st, we have that powder capture by gauge, and people are sort of more inflamed. So there were 19 resolves. I'm not going to read all of them, but here, resolved as true and loyal subjects of our gracious sovereign, George III, King of Great Britain. We are still subjects of the king, is the message here. But we have rights and we want them recognized. These acts, if quietly submitted to, will annihilate the last vestige of liberty in this province. We want our liberties that we've been accustomed to for more than a century. And Malden then votes to accept these resolves. So these are not only being put together in Concord, but they're being disseminated to respective towns, and they are voting to accept them. This is the process by which everybody's showing solidarity. So here Malden appoints people to go to the provincial Congress and to use their, wise reason. They also seem to think that things had come to such a pass that they needed a standing committee to deal with issues that came up. Now, this is as opposed to just having a meeting, a town meeting that you call when there's problems to be addressed. We didn't have something like a standing city council, which we have now. So they're creating a standing committee because things are going to come up more urgently. At that meeting, they were also working on the logistics of the militia, using their time during the winter to train and prepare for the spring. Warfare or conflict at that time was really kind of a seasonal activity. You didn't do it in the winter. So there's more that's going on with the militia. We're talking about how they're going to train, how often they're going to train. And there was an agreement made with people who were serving in the militia, and they signed it. Now we have more instructions for the patient, Mr. Harnden. And I will note that there was at the time, and there still is, a tension between two aspects of representative government. You elect people and send them off to do their job. You trust them. But you also may find from time to time that you need to tell them what you think. And so there were mechanisms for that. And when towns issued instructions to the representatives, they were often saying, here are our sentiments, and we trust you to do your duty. They were trying to hedge the issues there. So here is Mr. Harnden. He's been told are all now lies at stake. And I read into that phrase is there's nothing more to be lost here. We've got to do something. Now here's some more instructions. He says, don't acknowledge those new counselors appointed by the governor. They are not legitimate. And we want our regular counselors, our regular representatives to continue to meet in Congress, to continue to govern the colony.
So there were two sets of representatives?
Yeah, they were the ones that the governor was appointing under that new Massachusetts Government Act. And mostly those people were ignored. They were deemed illegitimate by most of the towns. Now, I'm not an expert in that area. I'm not sure what those folks actually ended up doing. We feel sorry for them here, but and here we say we're willing to risk our lives and fortunes rather than to submit. And that phrase will come back. We'll see that again and again. So here we are at the end of 1774. And you can see that although town meetings were prohibited, Malden did not really pay attention to that. They met in December to organize Minuteman and send more delegates to the provincial congress. And provincial congress is meeting in different places. Here they're planning to meet in Cambridge. They were moving around because they were meeting by the governor's lights, they were illegitimate. By the people's lights, they were the legitimate government. And, you know, a single meeting is not necessarily one day. It could take place over several days, it could be adjourned for several months. And that was one way they got around this idea that was only supposed to meet once a year. So here we arrive in 1775. And we are obsessed with military preparedness. This is from Malden, that we did a collection made for the relief of people in Boston. You know, Boston's having economic hardship at this point. The port's been closed. To make a critical review of the arms, to recommend that we get military discipline twice a week until the March meeting. We want them training, we want them meeting, we want them practicing. Right. So Captain Blaney shall regulate his list according to law, exempting none under 60, except those that are exempted by law. They probably have exemptions for people with disabilities, that kind of thing. So they're saying, like, don't let people off. We want them all to be servant. But this town will adhere to the laws of the province as if they could be executed. That's a really interesting phrase to me, because it says, well, we have the laws, we know what our laws have been, but we don't have the mechanisms now in place to enforce them. We don't have the courts settled. We have a lot of things going on. Here's what we sent to Boston at that particular moment.
That's it.
Sorry.
Can you go back?
Sorry. Two loads of wood, one pair of wooden shoes, a ton of hay, and about 12 pounds currency. I don't know whether that's a lot or a little, to be honest, but we tried. So here we are doing more military preparation. And we're gonna be prepared to get together urgently if we need to. Now, I think we all know what happened in April 19th of 1775. There were some issues with the British regulars coming out and trying to seize more arms and powder and ammunition. So how do we find out? Well, early in the morning of April 19th, a horseman came furiously along the Medford Road, otherwise known as Route 60, crying as he came, "The regulars are out." As we all know, they did not say the British are coming. When he came to the door of Kettle's Tavern, no one was stirring, but in a short time, the west rooms began to fill with excited villagers. The meeting house bell was rung, messengers were hastily dispatched, and the horsemen departed to spread the news farther away. Now, we're trying to figure out, Mark Linehan is actually engaged in trying to figure out who that was. Because we know where they came in Medford, they came to Isaac Hall's house, and then somebody came to Malden. So this was kind of a fractal thing where, they would come to one place and then they would send out other riders to inform nearby people and homes. But we don't know who that was. This is all from Corey, by the way, this particular section.
Do you know where Kettle's Tavern is?
Yes, it was really right in the center, kind of where the First Baptist Church is, I think, or maybe across the street from it. It's pretty much, in the center of town. And here, what's a picture of the tavern. Now the Minutemen gathered. Now what's ironic about the Minutemen is they were supposed to be able to gather at a moment's notice. But if you were not part of this organized group, you could just go. So it was actually other militiamen who started out first, and the Minutemen followed. And they marched to Arlington, Menotomy, and then some of them people came back, and they harried the British. We all know the British came back along the main street in Arlington, and they were harried by people along the way. I suppose some of the Malden people joined into that, and then some of them went to Somerville or the plains of Cambridge and formed part of that early army that then went to the Battle of Bunker Hill a few weeks later. Some of them just went home again. So April 21st, 2 days later, we had a town meeting. And I figure out where I am here, sorry. A lot of stuff is happening, including a question of what to do with some cannon that had come to Malden, and I won't go into all of that. But remember that Malden went all the way down to the Mystic River, it included what is now the town of Everett. So, you know, the idea of people coming to Malden by the river was a problem, and so they set a watch. And they had, again, to worry about being prepared. So after the Battle of Bunker Hill, which took place on June 17th, the British are in Boston with colonial troops around them. At this point, we have about 10,000 British soldiers in Boston. And here's what Corey says about Malden and the Battle of Bunker Hill. Many of the refugees came to Malden and Medford. And Malden, Medford, and Chelsea and Lynn all sent men to participate in what has become known as the Battle of Noddle's Island or the Battle of Chelsea Creek. They were basically stealing livestock from the British. And the Reverend Peter Thatcher of Malden wrote an account of this, and that's, I think, what Corey is relying on. One woman in Malden apparently here in the cannon went into convulsions and died. And Malden launched for attacks at the shore. So I have a mental block on whether Thatcher has a T in the middle or doesn't, and I think it's spelled different ways at different times, so don't worry too much about that. This is the death of General Warren, Battle of Bunker Hill. Now, I would forgive all of you right now if you had no idea who was in charge in Massachusetts. So we will take a little review of that. We have the in May 1774, General Gage arrives and to enforce the Government Act. And Massachusetts towns largely ignored the Government Act and kept meeting. General Gage disbands the Provincial Assembly, which promptly reorganizes itself as the Provincial Congress. And they met in secret after October 1774. They continued to operate as de facto government in the province. Once the siege of Boston began, they controlled everything but Boston, where Gage remained in control. The Provincial Congress at this point was meeting in Watertown. And once British left in spring 1776, the Provincial Congress was still in charge. That continued until 1780 when there was a new constitution. So here we are, the beginning of 1776. Right. Okay. The British besieged and Washington's army hunkered down for the winter. In early 1776, Thomas Paine writes, and more importantly, publishes his pamphlet, Common Sense. I have a copy of right here. That is one of the early bestsellers and that it lays out the logic behind independence. Why should American colonies be independent and why now? And it was very easy to read. It was very persuasive. And I think it had a real effect on how the people thought about this, right? The literacy rates, especially in the northern colonies, were quite high. So people could read this or have it read to them. Since 1770, when the Boston Massacre occurred on March 5th, there had been an annual oration commemorating that event. That was typically held in the Old South Meeting House, but there's a problem in 1776. You couldn't actually do it there because the British were in control of Boston. So in Watertown, Peter Thatcher of Malden reads the oration for the Boston Massacre that we marched on. Here is the end of his oration. With transport, my countrymen, let us look forward to the bright day which shall hail us a free and independent state. With earnestness, let us implore the forgiveness and the patronage of the being of all beings who holds the fate of empires in his hands. With zeal, let us exert ourselves in the service of our country in life. And when this earthly scene shall be closing with us, let us expire with this prayer upon our quivering lips. Oh God, let America be free. So that's a little example of Peter Baffer's rhetoric. Now, a couple of weeks after that, we have evacuation day, and we know the story of Henry Knox, who goes and gets cannon from Fort Ticonderoga in New York and brings them through the winter, March weather to Dorchester Heights, where they are then deployed under cover of clouds and darkness. And now the Americans have the upper hand over the British harbor. There's Henry Knox, and his painting shows him with a cannon, and now we understand why that is. And that's George Washington on Dorchester Heights. It's kind of an inspiring story, and we can celebrate Evacuation Day every year on March 17th. Now, it took a little bit of time for the British to actually leave. They kind of knew the writing on the wall. They knew that they wouldn't be able to hold on to Boston at that point. They do eventually leave Boston, and the Massachusetts militia and the new Continental Army under George Washington are able to take control of that. Washington had arrived on July 3rd to take charge of the Continental Army. So support's growing for independence. Right. And other colonies, as well as Massachusetts. And Massachusetts, in a formal sense, was linked to the party. North Carolina and Virginia had both expressed their desire for independence. On June 7th, Richard Henry Lee, who was a delegate to the Continental Congress by Virginia, put forth a resolution calling for independence, but the vote was put off for a time until some delegates could talk with their colonies. Everybody wants to know what the people think. It was feared that if the matter were pushed before the middle colonies were ready, they might secede from the Union. On May 10th, the Provincial Congress, remember them, asked the towns to make their feelings known to their representative. Now, this was not the whole Provincial Congress, this was the General Court. Provincial Congress was made up of the General Court, which was the House of Representatives, and the Council, which was smaller and more of an advisory group. Council didn't actually agree with doing this, so the General Court sent out the announcement. So why May 10th? Well, it was the last day of the outgoing representatives. New elections were held in the spring, and so on May 29th, the new Congress would gather. And in the intervening days, the Congress thought, well, there's time for towns to let their representatives know, so that when they gathered again on the 29th, there would be a definitive answer. You know, are we for independence or are we not? But another question, why were they asking? First, the Speaker of the House had been written to by Elbridge Gerry, who had recently joined the Continental Congress's delegation from Massachusetts in Philadelphia. He thought that if Massachusetts was out in front and firm, declaring independence, then other colonies might follow. In fact, the Mass delegation had been empowered to act as they saw fit, but they wanted a public declaration for its broader impact. So this May 10th request by the House was not simply, what do you think? It was more like, if this happens, are you all in? And will you say so loudly now, please? Malden was all in. And this is the question they were asked. Whereas by a resolve of the late House, the 10th of May, 1776, it was resolved that the inhabitants of each town in this colony ought in full meeting warned for that purpose to advise the person or persons who should be chosen to represent them in the next general court, whether it should the Honorable Congress, that's the Continental Congress, for the safety of said colonies, declare them independent from the Kingdom of Great Britain. They, he said inhabitants, will solemnly engage with their lives and fortunes to support them in the measure. So here's that question, lives and fortune again. So not everyone had time to get the instructions from their towns. The newspapers were slow, so towns didn't find out about the request soon enough. So the provincial Congress asked again. Now you can imagine them all getting there on the 29th. And some of them say, yes, we're for independence. And some of them say, what? I didn't hear about this. Wait a minute. So it's like, when you send an email out to a group of people and you don't get a lot of responses back, you send another one saying, in my email of May 10th, I said X. So here we are. And they find a way to give them more time and to ask and to send more information. So here on June 7th, they're sending out another notice. Malden, as we know, was one of the ones that responded promptly, issuing instructions to the representative as your sergeant. At this point, you might be wondering what other towns in Massachusetts did in response to the request by the provincial Congress. I'm glad you asked that question, because I have some answers. And if I can have a volunteer to hand out some of these things here, I'm sure I have enough copies for everyone. So this handout has a sampling of towns from around the Commonwealth. And these are transcribed from records of the state archives. I ask you to bear with me because some of the old handwriting is not the easiest to read. So in some cases, words are left out here and there. The spelling is a little bit funky, just what it was back then. And this will give you a sense of how these towns responded. So now we come to the great Malden narrative, which oversimplifies the matter a bit. According to that narrative, Malden was the first to respond and the only town to issue a forthright declaration, but it wasn't really the first. So here are at least some of the towns that met earlier and voted earlier, right? And again, this is from the Massachusetts State Archives, which are now digitized, many of them. So Walpole, New Salem, Medway, Billerica were all, and probably other places as well, because these records are not entirely complete, were voting before Malden did. So we weren't the first, and we were not the only town that had a lot to say about the matter. See, for example, in your handout, Rentham, Situate, Palmer, Natick, and Topsfield. You can see from your handout that some towns issued a very short and sweet response, like Taunton, for example, and others had a lot more to say. I will read Taunton's. We, at a town meeting legally formed and held at Taunton on Monday, the 3rd day of June, 1776, on the second article mentioned in the warrant, voted that if the American Congress should in their wisdom declare independent of Great Britain, then they, the inhabitants of this town, with their lives and fortunes, do solemnly engage to support them in the same. And that's it. And there were other towns that were similarly short and sweet. Now, we weren't the first and we weren't the only town to issue instructions, but I think based on what I had read, we were the most elegantly written. Right? And there are some copies over there of Malden's declaration if you haven't read it and you want to. But it's helpful, I think, to see this in context of what some of the other towns were saying. Some of them emphasized, Dora, question?
Do you think that Corey's right that we were first in putting it together, but it just took a little while for us to get it there?
No. Well, I mean, I think that who knows when it was written, right? We know that the town meeting was held on May 27th. I think that given that the provincial Congress made their request on the 10th, we were pretty prompt. But we then would give the information, a copy to Ezra Sargent, who then goes off to Watertown to meet with the provincial Congress on the 29th. So I think that's how the information got there. It went through the representatives, it didn't get sent off as a mail.
Who was the lead writer?
We don't know for sure, but everyone seems to think that it was Peter Thatcher. He had written, if you look at other things he's written, it's kind of very similar prose. And, in in the records, there's no, nothing that says, here, it was written by, as far as I know, Dory.
Well, there's one other guy that they sent me was a horse student in Harvard. And wouldn't have been able to do it. So, yeah, the other reference will be put.
There are possibilities that it was not Peter Thatcher, but we assume it was. But here we are, you know, the prose of our novel substance was arguably the most elegant, in my opinion. So. Meanwhile, the provincial Congress seems to have heard enough by July 3rd. A lot of responses came in during June from the representatives. And so on July 3rd, 1776, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress declares for independence.
Oh,
And
that was the information given. So they were down in Philadelphia.
right, so they had no idea that the day before, the Continental Congress had approved the Declaration of Independence. So we will talk a little bit about what happens next. So on June, you know, here's Continental Congress meeting. The Massachusetts was represented by John Adams, Samuel Adams, John Hancock, Robert Treat Payne, and Thomas Cushing initially, and then he was replaced by Elbridge Gerry. Now, they knew what they wanted to do, but they wanted to be on firm ground when they did it. So copies go out to express riders. The riders arrive in Massachusetts on July 15th. So it took a while for the news to get spread around. I mean, there may have been other back channels, I don't know. And here is one account of the first public reading at the Old State House in Boston on July 18th. Yesterday, the Declaration of Independence was published on the balcony of the townhouse. A detachment of the train of artillery with 2 field pieces and also a detachment of the colony troops attended in King Street. And after they finished reading the Declaration, there were 3 hearty cheers given. And the field pieces were discharged a number of times. The musketry and the several batteries in town and upon the island and at Nantucket fired, the bells rang, and in the afternoon was borne down the lion and unicorn from the east end of the townhouse, the king's arms taken down from the council chamber, courthouse, and other places. And towards evening, all were committed to the flames, to the satisfaction of everybody but the Tories. So that is what happened on July 18th. And you know, meanwhile, the provincial Congress is on vacation. They're in summer recess and dealing with their farms and all that good stuff. The signing of the Declaration actually takes place in August. And the provincial Congress eventually acknowledges and informs the House. The important period has at length arrived. The Honorable Congress has declared the United States American colonies free and independent states. This declaration we have ordered to be made public, agreeable to the request of Congress that every part of Massachusetts Bay, through every part of Massachusetts Bay, and we shall readily, although they already knew, right? Because they relate to the party. And shall readily concur with you in expressing approbation of the measure and readiness to risk our lives and fortunes in defense and support of it. Now, lives and fortunes comes up a lot, and so, but I love the phrase in the Malden Declaration, every drop of our blood, and the last drop of our blood into the last farthing of our treasure. That's a little bit more poetic, right, than just lives and fortunes. So the Continental Congress knew the people of Massachusetts were behind them, but they wanted them to say so publicly. Massachusetts leaders already knew most people in the towns were behind them, but they wanted to be told officially. The towns seem to have been greatly in favor. We don't know if any of them said no, because the records are not entirely complete here. There is a very good book about this by Pauline Mayer called American Scripture. And if you want to learn more about the various colonies and how they handled this question of independence. I recommend that book. So Malden wasn't the first or only town to issue instructions to its representatives, but it did so with highly elegant prose. And that's all I have for today. Thank you for coming. Thank you for listening. And I'm happy to take questions.
July 4th versus July 18th or July 19th.
Well, July 4th was when it was published in the paper in Philadelphia. And that became the day. Adams thought it was going to be July 2nd, which is when they made the decision. But that wasn't how it worked out. Mr. Mayor.
As a meeting, or were you surprised at how often they were able to evade British office? I mean, I think of today where you find out anything, but back then they were able to do all this without ever being caught.
Yeah, the provincial Congress was probably the most vulnerable because they had to get a bunch of people together to meet somewhere. And I have to think that that General Gage was not all that committed to stopping them from meeting. I don't really know, but yeah, I agree with you that that would have been hard.
So an error in his judgment.
Maybe.
Yeah.
You know, they met in Boston, they met in Cambridge, they met in Waterford, they met in different places depending on the week or the month or whatever they were meeting.
He didn't take that seriously. It's maybe what.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know what his group was doing. I mean, does he have representatives that he'd appointed in these various places, and maybe he was more concerned with them? I don't know.
Okay.
But yeah, and once, of course, once the revolution begins and we have the Battle of Bunker Hill and the British take over Boston, then they're focused on Boston. They're bottled up there, so they can't control what happens anywhere else.
Thank you.
I'm not gonna, Jim.
I found out recently, just doing genealogical research into my own family, that my 7th great grandfather was a judge in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and he was under the authority of the crown. But in this write-up of him, it says, we find him preparing, well, nevertheless, while holding that commission, he was foremost among those who were contending against the oppressions and wrongs committed in the name of the crown, and bent his energy toward preparing his people for the battle for freedom and liberty. And he became a member of the Committee for Safety in Pennsylvania. So these people were like really like doing the bidding of the king. They were signing all their judgments as a judge until 1777 under George III.
Well, yeah, Pennsylvania
well,
probably had a slightly different structure.
Right, but they're acting as revolutionaries. It's very interesting, but it was happening all over. But one of the things that this little bio of him says is that he drew great inspiration from the events in Boston, the atrocity really of the Tea Party, and so Boston was this inspiration to the other movements.
And Boston was writing to everybody. They were writing to their colonies. That circular letter that I mentioned was a big deal for the Massachusetts governor. I said, you shouldn't be doing this. You shouldn't be writing to other colonies. If you want to talk to other colonies, you should go through the crown. They didn't like the idea of people talking to each other. But, and that North Carolina resolved saying, like, we appreciate what's going on with these people in Boston and it's harming them. And we have,
But Boston was good at getting the word out that they were under.
Oh.
So it's interesting. It's like
the committees of correspondence were important. And they were corresponding with all the other towns, with Boston especially, because Boston was driving a lot of the opposition. John.
Well, funding, financially, is very, issue you're getting supposedly so how they collect the money, subdivisions, the funded.
Well, they were people with resources. There are records about, from the military perspective, of how the army was funded once it was formed, once the Continental Army was really formed. But, otherwise you're looking at city and town records, I think, town records from that period, There's not a lot said about money, like there was that piece about the militia and how often they should be training and meeting. And it said, we hope that the gentlemen of the town will encourage them. And encourage word means money, resources, food. Mr. Mayor,
Linda, not the first to declare, not the only town to bring instructions, but the only town, I think, where you tell you that fixed all their names. Is that not true?
good question. I mean, I'm always seeing copies of things and the copies aren't necessarily complete, the ones that are in the Mass Archives, so we don't know.
Somebody wrote that.
Yeah, and
I
then
don't
some,
know if it's story.
maybe it was, maybe they were right about that. I don't have good information one way or the other. I don't know.
I'm really surprised at the communication back and forth from town to town in Pennsylvania, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. People seem to, with limited writing skills, et cetera, and how they received all this information to be able to know which all these towns were doing. It's fascinating to me that the word was out and they did what they did.
That's why the committees of correspondence were really key, because you had to write something down, somebody had to deliver it. Yeah, we didn't have phones and
That's
internet.
That's why I'm fascinated, because they have to get on a horse and go out to Watertown or
Yeah.
further out to Concord. Concord's quite a ways even now.
And then people were cranking out essentially newspapers and
Yeah,
like
Yes.
printing a lot of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, you could do a whole other dimension of this and pull in what was being written in the newspapers. I didn't do that for tonight, but
Right.
maybe I will I'm sure we'll do this again in 2 years, right?
Yeah.
Because we'll have a big hoo-ha with May of 1776.
that's fascinating.
Nora?
No, I was just thinking of her question, and I was thinking that. Yes, but no, there were also a whole group of people who just kept on farming, and they just sort of ignored the whole.
Yeah.
Forward things, and so really, you had this small group of people who got together and started the flame going. And people kind of joined in when it began to affect them. And so I think people think it was like everybody was for it in the, quickly. But again, it lasted 13 years, so,
Yeah, yeah.
so people really got into it later. And so I always think of it as a small group of people who did a big thing, because a lot of the population just sort of kept on doing life and had no opinion.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's like anything else, that happens in our government. So there's always some people who are just gonna ignore it. Good question.
Yes, and thank you for sitting tonight. Just curious to know if we have a record of if there was an initial reading of the declaration in Malden and read it.
It's a good question, and I don't know the answer. I would guess, this is a guess, that they would have read it in the tavern. Because that is where they read the Constitution when it arrived.
It doesn't look very big, so,
You're right.
yeah. So Thatcher was a
Minister.
minister.
Yeah,
And a Baptist minister?
no, he was congregational.
Okay,
He would have been the main, first parish meeting, first parish minister at that time.
and from a wealthy family, essentially?
I don't know much about him. There is an article that someone wrote, that this guy wrote an article about him at one point.
Okay,
I can look that up. But he was young at this time. He was kind of a young firebrand. Yes.
So, Paul Revere, raised the alarm through Bedford Center on April 19th.
He comes to Medford, but then somebody else comes from Medford to Malden, and we don't know who that was. So Paul Revere kept going, but then, from the Medford, place, which was Isaac Hall's house, other riders go off in different directions to inform people. So we don't know who the guy was who came down the Medford Road to tell Malden what was going on. But
Mark will find it.
maybe, it's just to be found. I haven't found it yet. Anything else?
Did you say Medford or he came down with the citizen?
Well, it came down the Medford Road, which would have been the road from Medford. That's what they would have called it at the time.
It just, that town, I was confused. I thought that was where Freedom Eagles is. Is it not?
Well, it's somewhere in that general vicinity, but I don't know exactly the location.
I was thinking Dunkin' Donuts, but that's. That,
No,
that.
yes, it's, I think you're right, it was on the other side, it was like either where the hole is or a little further down.
Do you think they were, the city hall kind of in relationship to that, because I'm thinking.
This, yeah, the city hall was in that, on that block as well, the old city hall, the 19th century city hall.
What was the population at Malden and all around? No,
Oh, I have that figure somewhere. But
A few thousand, like,
maybe not even that much, maybe more like 1,000.
really?
Wow.
And is it apocryphal that people watched Battle of Bunker Hill from Waits Mount? Is that true?
Well, they certainly could have watched from the shoreline. Because they would have, I mean, remember Malden went all the way through Everett.
Yeah,
down to
okay.
Shore. So they could have watched it from Waits Mountain, but they also could have watched it from further down.
And you said that there were 10,000 British soldiers in Boston at one time. That's
That would have been after the Battle of Bunker Hill.
right, but 10,000, I can see why people who inhabited Boston would have been on edge.
Right,
10,000 of
right.
them,
Well,
Boston was
this
that big.
is the siege. A lot of people did leave. But that there were certainly some people left there
Yeah.
who were not loyalists.
Yeah,
It was a difficult time for them all.
yeah, they would have commandeered a lot of food and stuff.
Sorry, I put you on the spot, but when did they burn Charlestown? When
Um,
was the big burning of, because
That
that
was-
add.
that was in conjunction with the Battle of Bunker Hill, I think, and not long later.
There was a sense that Malden people could see that, feel that new,
Yeah.
that, because they had seen themselves as Charlestown.
Right, we had been part of, Malden had been part of Charlestown before it became its own town, right, yeah, and some people came, refugees came from Charlestown out to Malden and Medford.
Refugees, yeah.
Any other questions? Thank you all for being here, I appreciate it. And please enjoy the refreshments, our Marilyn, a lover of our hospitality committee has graciously provided some refreshments here, feel free to hang out for a little while.
And we have tried, we hope cross fingers we take this so that it can be shown again. And we again invite everyone, to please come tomorrow evening at 5 o'clock to Bell Rock. It's 100 Green Street. You can't miss it. We'll have a wonderful William Diamond fife and drum corps playing. There will be the reading of the Declaration, which is always exciting. And then afterwards, we will have a wonderful unveiling of the Black Revolutionary War Soldier Monument, which has been working on for 4 years now. So I'm pretty excited about all of this. So please come if you can. And if you happen to just have some Revolutionary War garb in your home, please wear it. I'm gonna bring a couple tri-corner hats. So if some men wanna wear them, we'll have them available. So.
Where, can you park anywhere on the street over there?
I don't know what the mayor is today.
I would say Green Street. What, the cemetery side? Yeah, I would say Green Street. It's not, it's usually park here, so I think that's.
But at least living there, these department says a big parking lot. Could we park in there?
I think so, yeah, I don't want to say for sure.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
You did a great job.
Hopefully we'll have.
Yeah, put it on our page.
There are, that's really good. Very
The only situation.
Yeah.
And.
Many than just.
Not sure.
Many. So, you know, yeah, maybe just runs with better practice from like.
Which,
Yeah. It was paid, but it was mission. It must have been somebody.
Like, I don't know, it's like hiding the pin.
So not when the fighting got underway.
I like that.
He got. Farmer, Pennsylvania,
Well, it's like the question that I think, you know,
Powell,
we have,
they sent it down to India.
lady,
And supposed to be great. So nobody-
James Lane.
So we ended up around sipping all these farmers. But the was that right.
They're all signed by the.
You know, so it's awkward. No, but it's like. Really long. It's like somebody got an paid for the So.
So the whole thing.
His, in fact,
British, so like,
yeah.
Yeah.
All of it.
Yeah, British.
Right, then again, I think
They were French and
realizing that some of these are pretty, it's Spain, you know.
Yeah.
Somebody wrote a book about this family
I didn't know.
in my 1907. So all these details. When I go to
Elected and appointed by one side, elected.
Like, I'm sure it's a lot of what we're going to get started, like,
You know.
archives, I think, so I have to go out and for a lot. And there's a whole area.
Whatever they say, that's, yeah. So that's.
People trying to tell you, they, everything's filled up. It's fun. We thought I felt a real long guy.
Well, you are.
It's like a person I soldier. At the young man, or maybe the. Yeah, it's like a mercenary soldier in France, right? He was actually.
If you had enough money.
Because I'm gonna go see what they.
The town's raised.
Goes to one of that box, one.
7 months.
Yeah, I don't know, it goes
And these people who are paid, go for it.
That's now, that's.
Oh, you could pay some. Well,
But it goes back.
you could pay some. They had votes.
Yeah.
You know, so they, some people. So others.
Yeah, they did it to kids. There's this story in this book about how he'd be chased by.
And they would say, I'm
He's running down, she's running right in the boat, she tracks the soldiers over the end of the board, and jumps in the boat, and they row off. Yeah, so I. Yeah.
I'm gonna say, yes,
So then, so this woman, they live in Philadelphia, and then they almost needed to go to Lancaster by, which eventually Lancaster County. They had a lot of.
I mean, it was.
That's their son. But this is like, you know, part of the same kind of activity. It's like everything off. Swiss, or German. There are a lot of different. We all just receive. Because they wanted to have the secret there. So there must have been the German said,
And Peter Thatcher is it's always, he was kind of, that was his gig. He was actually, as not only right, that Boston massacre, they were other things. He was kind of known,
but anyway, it's like,
having
I'm
process.
just reading, I have to read the whole book.
So he was.
I had no idea, I started this research to see if like.
It's gonna hire them.
Because I only have one, go back to the
You know, and not to do that.
great grandparents, and one line. In this country. Every time, everybody else is paying for it.
Society read
In the book, it's in the council, you are. Very, very, very. Sooner say, they-
Yeah.
It's kind of like a little. Go there.
From one side.
Yeah. I know something.
Oh, geez.
Yeah. And then sorting her, stuff, and they are sometimes available on. So.
Right, yeah, but it's private. And I don't just. Sure. They were talking about just how. Oh, I yes. Small side.
Well, the Koch brothers did, Washington, kind of based upon.
I know, I was.
And they sent it at TAR, you see, then
I
lost.
mean, my own mother.
After getting finished. Anyway, and so
Now
they said,
research and stuff.
get her to send it. Washington. Every company that's people, people notify me. Not be there in contact with the cops, then the cop. They. But. So wait, it's
Funny, I grew up in.
Switch.
My grandmother was a house.
It's always like, remember I think in the summer or whatever. Started talking, it's like, what did you?
She was like a single mother. She had a-
You never know. I don't remember much of my voice, but I don't get anything.
A little bit when you're like, literally, never been to in person.
I mean, you know, like, yeah.
You never went any further than an hour. Yeah.
This tells me.
But it was.
And if they don't have a problem, take your children. They will apply, you know, they had a family, but it's not, Venice published a. That's all, but it's a religious.
You should that.
It's not every. It's like a family. So I keep. I don't think it is. I mean,
It's not in a rush hour. It's like. So he's like, oh, family. It's like, yes. Yeah, from him. Went to Ohio, some, you know. And like my grandmother, very high farm. Fox of.
Linda?
So.